Hello and welcome to another edition of the Sports Pro podcast. I am your host, Tom Bassam. This week I'm lucky enough to be joined by a couple of my highly esteemed colleagues in the editorial department here at Sports Pro. I'm with features editor Sam Carr.
Hi Tom, thanks for having me back on. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you very much. And for the first time, I am joined by Sports Pro reporter Arif Islam. Hello, Arif.
It's a pleasure to be here. I feel like a international soccer star making his debut for his country.
International soccer star as well.
And he's used soccer too. This guy knows the style guide.
Yeah.
Before I have a chat with Arif and Sam, you are going to hear a little bit about probably one of the biggest deals in the sports industry right now, and more specifically the motorsport industry, as we just clip in a little excerpt from our sister podcast, Mike's Out, from Black Book Motorsport, as they discuss the very recent acquisition of MotoGP by Liberty Media, the owners of Formula One. They've now made the move to buy the biggest motorbike series in the world. Let me hand over to Mike's Out host, Cian Brittle, alongside Tom Brown and Alice Evans.
The big news, obviously, in the motorsport world right now is Liberty Media have acquired MotoGP. It's been rumoured for a while. We probably saw it coming. Dorna admitted that rumours of a sale were true. In January, Liberty Media emerged as the front runner last month, and it seems things have moved very, very quickly for this €4.2 billion deal to be finalised. Obviously, that is the enterprise value of the deal. The equity value of the deal is €3.5 billion. In simple terms, the difference is the enterprise value is the, overall value of the deal, and the equity value is what Liberty Media have actually paid for MotoGP. There's a lot of reasons behind that. MotoGP has a fair bit of debt. They owe nearly €1 billion to BNP Paribas. So there's a few things going on behind the scenes there. But overall, Liberty Media has obviously moved into the MotoGP world. They already have the ownership of F1. But I think the big point from our side is Liberty Media had a massive effect on the overall marketing of F1 and how it was consumed by fans. Coming to you first, Alice, how do you sort of remember that initial period where Liberty Media purchased F1 and how things, changed for the way that you could, consume content from the sport?
Going quickly back to the MotoGP side of things, I think it's clear that Liberty see the value in the sport, having stated that they want to expand this to an even wider global audience. For the MotoGP fans, the team, the shareholders, the commercial partners, it's going to affect everything. Then you add on top of that, their influence with Formula One and the trajectory we've seen with particularly younger audiences watching the sport, with their new focus on digital and new partnerships, etc., coming in off the back of that. It will definitely be really interesting to see what learnings they can take from that and what they can apply and won't apply to MotoGP, because, ultimately not one size fits all. MotoGP's demographic is very different to Formula One. So I don't expect that we will see exactly the same approach and tactics that we have seen with Formula One. But I'd be curious to see if there's, another Netflix series potentially to come off the back of it that's had really great results for Formula One, and how they switch up their digital platforms in particular to attract new, younger audiences, because that's another thing that we've seen them focus on massively since this transfer over.
Absolutely. I don't know, Tom, if you see any particular similarities maybe between, F1 as it was purchased then by Liberty Media and the MotoGP that Liberty Media is purchasing today.
I think one big similarity is both have a very hardcore fan base. As Alice mentioned, the demographics are different, but bike racing in general, particularly MotoGP, is known across the motorsport industry as having, the fans that are really avid MotoGP fans are incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly passionate, perhaps more so than any other series. So I think that having that very strong fan base from which to build is definitely a similarity. I think I completely agree with Alice when it comes to how they're going to engage with younger audiences. I think that's a similar challenge that MotoGP have now as F1 did back in 2017. And we've seen since Liberty have taken over F1, not just through Drive to Survive, but through opening up, a lot more behind the scenes content, bringing the drivers much more to the fore, allowing them to show their personalities a lot more. I think a lot of those tactics, I wouldn't be surprised if they are something we see Liberty try to bring to MotoGP as well.
Do you think that that Drive to Survive model is as simple as just replicating it and, rolling out almost the same thing for MotoGP? As Alice said, it might not be a case of one size fits all.
I think there's definitely still value in it. I think they need to look at how they don't just carbon copy. I mean, we've seen from NASCAR's documentary over the winter and the effect that that's had in the early part of the season with their viewership figures would seem like it's had a positive effect. So that would suggest that there is still merit in that format, even though it's now 6-7 years since we first saw it with Drive to Survive. I think they'll need to cater to the different audience that MotoGP has versus F1. And a big thing as well, I think, is the standing of the drivers. You know, we know that Marc Marquez is comfortably the best known rider in the current field in terms of social media following. He is streets ahead of everybody else. All of the others are pretty much of a muchness in the case of, you know, not having huge social media profiles. And it's telling that even the most followed motorcycle rider of recent times by a country mile is Valentino Rossi, who obviously hasn't been racing for at least a year or two now. So I think bringing the drivers more to the fore is something that MotoGP will definitely need to do. And we know from Drive to Survive that having those personalities on show for the fans is something that means they can really engage with the sport.
And I guess it's a really important point. And I wanted to get your perspective on this, Alice, because I guess how important is it for you as a fan to have that connection, I guess, with the riders or drivers, depending on MotoGP or Formula One? Obviously, we got that through Drive to Survive and getting to know the drivers on a more personal level. But I feel like maybe that's potentially the thing that's missing from MotoGP at the moment.
I think sometimes, you know, when you look at drivers overall, you want to look at the impact they're having on and off the track. You know, it's not just about how well they're performing and how many podiums they're on or what great commercial they've done. For long-term marketability, you really want to see what drivers and teams advocate for, you know, things like diversity, inclusion, sustainability, etc. Otherwise, it just feels like a very transactional thing, like the drivers are just there to do their job, get their paycheck. And that's where the lack of authenticity and relatability comes into play. And fans really do just want to find an athlete and a team that resonates with them and shows a bit of their personality on screen. And I think Formula One has been doing that a lot more with like the likes of TikTok, for example. It's become a much more fun, playful approach to things that's shown a completely different side to the business and the teams and the personalities behind that. So yeah, I think that definitely comes into play with a lot of things, but authenticity and relatability has definitely got to be those two key driving factors into what makes an athlete or a team really popular.
Do you think we'll see, I guess, maybe an instant overhaul of MotoGP's marketing strategy, or do you think it will be a more gradual process as maybe Liberty Media finds out what works and what doesn't work in the motorcycling world? I
think, yeah, you probably got to find your feet, right? You've got to trial things that might work and trial things that might not work, but it is ultimately a learning process. Like I said before, not one size fits all. Just because it worked for Formula One does not mean it's going to work for MotoGP. I definitely think a multi-channel approach will work best in this sort of time frame because, you know, you need to be across as many channels as possible in order to figure out what works and sort of develop something from there.
I guess looking at the deal itself, and Tom, it would be interesting to hear what you think on this. Why do you think Liberty Media have gone after MotoGP at a time like this? You know, obviously they're doing extremely well with F1. Do you think maybe there's some untapped potential in MotoGP? They've seen, you know, potential growth opportunities, say, in the US?
I think there's definitely untapped potential with MotoGP. I mean, first and foremost, just focusing on the track, you know, we can see that it's an incredibly competitive series. You know, the racing, certainly this season and last season, has been far more exciting, far more closely fought than it has in Formula One. So I think from a pure spectacle, there's definite excitement around MotoGP and the on-track action that it is producing at the moment. I think there's definitely untapped potential. One thing I find really interesting with MotoGP is some of the markets that they are racing in where not a lot of other series are. You know, for example, they race in Thailand, they race in India, they race in Indonesia. You know, these are areas that Formula One has largely not touched, at least not in recent times. Plus, then there is the question of the US, as you say, Kian. And, you know, we spoke on the podcast a few weeks ago about Trackhouse Racing coming across, obviously, an existing NASCAR team joining the MotoGP grid for this year, whereas F1 has been famously slow in welcoming another US team to the grid. And obviously the Andretti saga will no doubt rumble on for many months, if not years to come. MotoGP haven't wasted any time. You know, they brought across this well-known NASCAR team into the series. They're racing at Kota already. They're in discussions for a second race, if reports are to be believed. So looking at that international expansion under Liberty, I think will be something to keep a really close eye on.
And obviously, Liberty Media have come in. They've purchased approximately 86% of Dorna, the commercial rights holder of MotoGP. Dorna are going to retain around 14%. I think continuity-wise, it's probably a good thing in terms of, Dorna will continue to be independently run. Carmelo Ezpeleta will still be in position as chief executive, as he has been for many years. So you've got that continuity of leadership at MotoGP, but you have that overarching marketing approach from Liberty Media and the hope that, I guess, that they will replicate what they've done in F1, in MotoGP. But I guess almost the fan reaction has been quite negative, at least from what I've seen across social media, in terms of MotoGP fans thinking, oh, Liberty Media are going to do to us what they did to F1. And there's that sort of hardcore fan element, I guess, to it, where they think it's going to get commercialized and it's going to lose a lot of its essence and what makes MotoGP. I don't know whether you have seen any of that, either of you, or whether you have any thoughts on, I guess, that initial fan reaction to the Liberty Media purchase.
MotoGP has a very loyal fan base, and ultimately, not everyone might be happy with such a big change. But this brings in huge opportunity to expand MotoGP to a much wider audience. I just think it's again that fine balance of not being too overly commercially driven, like outwardly. Otherwise, it just looks like a hard sell all the time. There needs to be that element of playfulness and fun and like engagement there, which shows that, it's not just a transactional thing. They're doing it to benefit the growth of MotoGP in itself.
I think I'd agree. Obviously, a lot of what Liberty has done with F1 has been positive. Purely, a lot of it is very overly commercial. That I've no doubt there will be potentially more traditional F1 fans that will have winced at almost everything that happened at the Las Vegas Grand Prix last year. But on the flip side, we've heard Zach Brown recently say that now, the majority of F1 teams are not only financially stable, but making profit. That is something that was not the case pre-Liberty. So from a financial security perspective, we know that MotoGP have had some troubles in the last few years, obviously not aided by the COVID-19 pandemic, but for bringing a bit more financial stability to the whole paddock, I think Liberty has done very good work in F1, and that's no doubt something that will be a plus to fans. I think it's understandable some of the reluctance from particularly, the most avid MotoGP fans, but I think commercially, on the whole, Liberty has brought a lot more stability to F1.
Yeah, and I think that's completely fair. But in my mind, we go back, there was a time where MotoGP and F1 were owned by the same equity firm, CVC Capital Partners, which obviously eventually sold to Liberty Media 2018, 2019, correct me if I'm wrong. They originally owned MotoGP and bought F1, but then had to sell MotoGP in 2006 because EU competition regulators basically didn't allow them to own both. They obviously competed with each other in terms of both being global motorsport series. So there's this added angle that maybe isn't being considered as much as it should be, which is that Liberty Media may not actually get this deal cleared and over the line by the end of this year. It may not be allowed. My follow-up question to that, which might be quite controversial, is that is Liberty Media in a position where they are actually thinking we could sell F1 by the end of this year? This could be something that we're actually a lot more open to than we have been previously. If we're going off the past where CVC were not allowed to own both, that could very well be something that's put at Liberty Media's doorstep. So that's my question. Do you think Liberty Media is suddenly a lot more open to selling F1?
It's a big question, Kian. If they were, it's really got to go to the right person. There's been a lot of successes under the ownership of Liberty, and there's been some things that might not have been as successful. Ultimately, if they were going to change ownership, they need to consider who they're having those discussions with and if that's going to be the right fit, because that could be hugely detrimental to the brand image of Formula One. So, yeah, I mean, who knows what goes on behind the scenes. If they are discussing it, then I hope, the next owner, whoever that's going to be, is good for the brand image of Formula One.
Definitely. And Tom, to put you on the spot?
To put me on the spot, I'd be tempted to say that following Formula One, you should never be too shocked by anything that happens It would be a surprise if Liberty decided to sell, I think, in the short term, let's say in the next kind of 6 to 12 months. But I can absolutely see the angle, as you rightly say, Kian, there's been periods in the past where the two championships were owned by the same organisation, and that ultimately didn't last. There was obviously some rumours towards the end of last year with F1. FIA president got in a spot of hot water about some of the comments that he made that F1 weren't too pleased with. I think there's one or two potentially more obvious suitors if F1 did go on the market. But again, I would be surprised if that happened in the short term, but you can never know for sure with F1, let's be honest. And what is absolutely certain is if Liberty did look to sell it in the next 6 to 12 months, they no doubt will make a fairly healthy profit on what they bought it for 6-7 years ago.
If you're looking for more insights into the business of motorsport in your podcast feed, then Mike's Out is definitely the show for you. Newly launched by our sister publication, Black Book Motorsport, Mike's Out can be found streaming bi-weekly on the Black Book LinkedIn page, and then a couple of days later on all good podcasting platforms. Right, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Okay, fascinating stuff. Guys, I don't feel like we can really add too much to that. Let's move on to some stuff we might be a little bit more familiar with. Now, Sam, last week you wrote a really, really interesting piece of analysis on the German Football Association, DFB, their rather controversial move to end a 77-year association with the sportswear brand Adidas. Adidas, of course, based in Germany, to make the move to have their kit supplied by Nike. Now, this sent a few shockwaves around the industry, right?
Yeah, I think particularly in Germany where, as you said, Adidas has been associated with the German national football teams for over 70 years. Those teams have sported that brand during their World Cup wins, during their Euros triumphs. So for that change to come, and for it to come so abruptly, was quite surprising for a lot of people. It's a contract that I don't think anyone thought Adidas was ever going to lose. But I think when you sort of dive a little bit more into the detail, then you can sort of see the reason that it has happened and why it has happened now. The key detail, to be honest, is what's being reported in German media. I think it was Handelsblatt in Germany reporting that Nike offered to pay 100 million euros per year to get that kit contract from 2027 until 2034. And basically Adidas just weren't prepared to match that offer or couldn't match that offer. They already pay 50 million euros a year. So I think the idea of doubling that outlay probably wasn't that appealing to them, irrespective of how much, heritage and how much tradition is associated with the partnership. And I think also just you have to sort of take into account the position of the DFB, the position of Adidas at the moment as well. DFB, its national team, the men's national team anyway, has been underperforming in recent years at national tournaments, so they're not getting the same kind of bonus payments as they would have been before. Adidas, as a lot of people listening to this podcast will know, has kind of really been trying to navigate the fallout from its collapsed partnership with Kanye West and the Yeezy line that he left behind and what to do with that inventory. It's hit their finances really hard. So I think what you basically had was a federation in the DFB that is struggling a little bit financially at the moment and needs to make as much money as it can to support its members. And you had Adidas, sportswear brands, one of the biggest sportswear brands in the world, but one that's fallen on hard times and probably wasn't in a position to match what was probably quite an opportunistic bid from Nike to kind of, kick its biggest rival while it was down.
As sort of Sam said there, this has come at a bit of a low moment for Adidas. Can you kind of give me a little bit of background?
Yeah, in the past 10 years, this is the first time they posted a loss, and it's quite significant. The year prior, it was $250 million profit. I guess it just showed the state that Adidas are currently in. I guess with the German national team, it has been a brand that has been intrinsically linked with Adidas since the 1950s. And yeah, there's been quite a bit of a fallout in Germany with a German minister coming out saying the deal shows a lack of patriotism. It has not gone down well in Germany.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where you feel like they're so intrinsically linked. As Sam said, it's one of those things where they've been together for 7 years. Just sort of one of those deals that you didn't think was ever really going to end. Do you think, Sam, that this is sort of the end of the story for this? Do you think Adidas can come back, or is it maybe think this is a sign of a bit of terminal decline setting in at the brand?
I don't think it's a sign of terminal decline at all. I think actually, I don't think it's a disaster for Adidas, and I'm not necessarily sure anyone's making it out to be. It's a decent PR play from Nike, I think, but I can't imagine this deal alone is something that massively moves the needle financially for Adidas at the moment, and I don't think it will for Nike either. I can't imagine that Nike is suddenly going to, double the sales of Germany national team kits to justify the amount that it's paying. And I think as well, if Adidas had gone out and doubled what it was spending on the German national team kit, I think it would have looked a little bit bad at a time when they should be being a little bit more frugal. And if anything, you can probably commend them for not getting lured into a bidding war in that way. And I think if anything, Adidas have come out of this quite well. People seem to be pinning a lot of the blame on the DFB for accepting, and they've been very candid about the fact that they're accepting this because it was a better financial offer. So Adidas has kind of been painted as the victim in all this. And I think what you're actually going to see is perhaps even like a rush for people to, buy Adidas retro kits before this new deal starts. It might be a good opportunity for Adidas to push out some of those more historic kits they've made in the past to kind of cash in on that before the deal ends. What you might also see is a bit of a struggle for Nike to win over German football fans who are probably quite loyal to Adidas given how long that partnership has been. And I think also it frees Adidas up in a way, right? Now that they know they haven't got that kit going forward, it gives them a chance to have a run at maybe potentially other kits that are coming on the market. I think the French Football Federation just launched the tender for their kit supply contracts, which Nike currently has. So maybe Adidas will test them there and maybe try and lure that one away. I think Brazil's deal is coming up soon as well. So I think, kit deals change all the time. I don't think it has a massive impact on the bottom line. But as I say, it's a nice little PR line for Nike to be able to say that they've ousted their biggest rival in its home market.
The point you made about the DFB getting quite a lot of the flack here, what were some of the reasons they gave for accepting the higher offer, aside from the fact, obviously, the massive increase in cash?
Yes, I mean, obviously the DFB, by virtue of the fact that it's a governing body, it's not just a commercial vehicle. It's not just there to make money. It has a duty to grow the sport of football in Germany. It has a duty to its members, and it's one of the biggest member-based federations in the world. And one of the things that they pointed out is that it financially supports its members rather than being financed by them. So I think just when you look at it from a pure kind of business perspective, as I mentioned earlier, for them to kind of, in the same way that it would have been a pretty bad look for Adidas to double the amount that it was paying to retain the contract at a time when their finances are particularly bad, I think it would have looked equally bad if the DFB had turned away an offer worth 100 million euros a year at a time when their finances maybe aren't quite as rosy as they have been previously. And that was kind of what they pointed to in a Q&A they published on their website. They also mentioned that they had to come out with the announcement when they did because of stock market rules and the way it could have impacted share prices at Nike, Adidas, other companies that may have been involved in the process. So it took them a day to publish that, so they maybe weren't quite as prepared for the backlash they were going to receive. But I think they have been quite candid in answering the questions and explaining that, this was a financially motivated decision more than anything else.
Interesting stuff. Well, it's going to be a bumper time for Adidas Kittel, you think, if Germany managed to repeat some of their performances from their friendlies against France in the home Euros they've got coming up this summer. You feel like if they perform well in that, it could be quite a decent exit for Adidas.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, the other kind of interesting story in football last week, or at least what I thought was the most interesting story in football last week, was the very significant investment in a second-tier English club, Ipswich Town, obviously famous club, been in the Premier League before, got very far in Europe before, famously managed by Sir Alf Ramsey. They were acquired a couple of years ago by some American investors, and more recently they just announced a deal for a whole raft of new investment. Arif, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yep, for sure. Ipswich Town announced a £105 million investment from US private equity firm Bright Path Sport Partners, which I guess now values a championship club at £260 million.
It's a 40% investment, 105 million for 40%. Yeah, works out 260 mil. That sounds like big money for a team that's not even in the Premier League.
Yeah, for sure. I think a few years ago, such a deal would have been unprecedented, but it just shows you the global appeal of the soccer pyramid. You wouldn't be able to make these sort of investments in US-based sports because of the way the leagues are cut off. But with this sort of investment, I guess the upside for a lot of these international investors is almost unprecedented in sports that may be regional to them. Ipswich are currently top of the league, so in a year's time they would probably make it to Premier League unless something incredibly poor happens within the league. But yeah, it's looking like a shrewd investment. And in the grand scheme of things, £100 million for a US equity firm isn't the biggest loss. So to them, it's probably a win-win.
This looks like a pretty opportunistic sale, actually. I mean, it could potentially backfire. We saw that with Reading, I believe, a couple of years ago. They were in the Championship playoffs, sold to Die Young, and then ultimately missed out on promotion and now are very much in the doldrums. But you'd think, well, you'd hope anyway, for Ipswich's sake, that doesn't happen in this occasion, and that both of these US-based investors look like they may have managed to get what could potentially be a fairly well-run Premier League club at a decent price.
Yeah, there's like two ways of looking at it, I think. So obviously you've got the current owners who have sold a stake. So Game Changer 20, who only bought, I think they only bought Ipswich in 2021, and Ipswich were toiling at that point, really. They were still in League One at that stage. Kind of fans a little bit disillusioned with the ownership at that point. As you mentioned already, they're a pretty famous club with a proud history. They've won the UEFA Cup before, so got a decent sized stadium, got a really good following. So it's a club that has a lot going for it. And yeah, when that takeover happened back in 2021, I think they paid £40 million. So on the one side, you've got those owners at the moment looking at the current trajectory Ipswich are on. Arif mentioned they're top of the table, in with a really good shout of getting promoted to the Premier League this season. So for them, their investment could become even more valuable. They're probably looking at it thinking, we know how quickly things in football can change. There's still a chance we might not get promoted this season. You've got to think about it that way. So let's at least sell a minority stake for this amount of money while we can, while retaining that control of the club and potentially getting more further down the line if they do make it to the Premier League. And then I think if you look at it on the other side, for Bright Path Sports Partners, they probably looked at this and thought, okay, this is a club we can get in with that valuation that you mentioned. It's not too dissimilar to what a lot of lower league Premier clubs are valued at. They probably looked at it and thought, this is a club that's the size of a lower league Premier League side. And yeah, we can get in at the time when the momentum's good. So let's hedge our bets on the fact that they are going to get into the Premier League in the next, if not this year, in the next few years. And also hedge our bets on the fact that, that 40% investment that we've made, that is going to become more valuable because the club is on that trajectory that it is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of continues what I think has been a creeping trend, really. Like, you've seen some really high profile examples of this with Wrexham, of course, like Rob McElhenney and Ryan Reynolds buying into that at an extremely low valuation. And I mean, they look on course for a second successive promotion. They'll be up in the third tier next year, probably. You've got the owners of Burnley who bought in, obviously at a very cheap price. It's not just kind of the high-profile Todd Bowleys of the world from the US side buying into these clubs. They're able to see the value in the pyramid and take advantage of it. I think there are some really sort of key things here that are changing in the English football ecosystem that are fueling that. My kind of theory on it is that you've got this new regulator coming in. The EFL have done a tremendous amount of work for the last few years, but really trying to make sure that their clubs are financially stable post-COVID. So there's a lot of rules now around squad cost, essentially, to try and make sure that clubs aren't just spending and spending and spending for the sake of it and are able to live within their means. That, I think, makes them attractive as investment opportunities. I guess we haven't really seen whether or not these guys are here for the hard times yet, apart from at Burnley.
For sure. And Nottingham Forest can be an example of something that does go wrong. And I think these recent investments in the Championship, the need for investment isn't as steep and the repercussions aren't as bad, because with the recent point deductions from Everton and now Nottingham Forest, you see a lot of it is down to transfers. And in the Championship and lower leagues, transfer fees aren't as big, which is a major factor to why a lot of these clubs are having losses. So yeah, it's almost a soft launch into the Premier League a lot of these clubs are looking for. With Wrexham is, I think, an example not many will take, because it is almost a flip of a coin working your way up through multiple leagues, whereas the Championship is a lot more of a safe bet.
Yeah, for sure. Sam, I don't know what your thoughts are on that investment opportunity in the EFL. I don't know. To me, it seems like a good time to be buying in, but potentially, there are still certainly pitfalls.
Yeah, I think potentially, yeah. Arif made a good point before when he mentioned that because of the closed nature of US leagues, the investors can't kind of invest in potential in the way that a lot of the US investors are doing by buying a Championship side. I still think sort of some of the deals that you've referenced there, whether it's Burnley, Ipswich, or even I guess Leeds and 49ers Enterprises who bought into them, I think those are still at sort of the top end of the football pyramid, at the top end of the EFL, and there's kind of the potential there. You can see it. That those clubs are going to be in and around the top end of the Championship, perhaps flirting with promotion, perhaps having a season here and there. Leeds especially are a very big club, irrespective of what league they're in. You're going to be able to sell tickets, and you're going to have significant attention on that football team. Wrexham is a very unique situation in that two Hollywood actors essentially bought that club for a documentary in the first instance and have managed to make a success of it on the pitch too, which is great, but it has also kind of had a knock-on impact and distorted the finances lower down the pyramid. So there are sort of two ways of looking at it. So whether I think like the EFL more generally is becoming a more attractive investment opportunity, I think it's too early to say. We're still seeing, I think you referenced them before, Reading, of course, have had some really tough financial times. Several other clubs are still sort of struggling a little bit. But as you mentioned, yeah, there is hopefully more financial stability. There's more due diligence being done when new owners are coming in. So yeah, hopefully it is being on a more financial footing. But I think once the regulator comes in and we see things like, and this new deal for football as well, which we talk about quite a lot and probably not worth getting into because we don't have the time just now. But I think once that happens, you'll maybe see the Championship and maybe even further outside of that become more attractive to investors, especially because, they've got their new TV deal starting next year, which doubles the value of the current one with Sky. So that's another thing that we'll probably see valuations go up and make it a more attractive proposition to investors.
Yeah, I think currently there is something like 22 EFL clubs with American investors. I wouldn't be surprised in the next couple of years if we saw that number increase a little bit further. The final story I wanted to touch on today, Sam, was a story that, it was a strange deal basically from when it was announced. And this is, of course, the collapse of the Minnesota Timberwolves deal with Alex Rodriguez, A-Rod, and Mark Law, who were buying the NBA franchise in like a phased takeover where they seem to have hit some of the marks, but not all of them. And now it's completely fallen apart.
Yeah, as you say, it was like a pretty weird deal from the start. So they first agreed it in 2021. The idea was basically that A-Rod and Mark Lowry were essentially going to buy the team in 20% installments. So they already own 40% of the team, and the expectation was that by the end of March this year, they were going to take full control from Glenn Taylor. But then a few murmurings coming out throughout March cast some doubt over the deal. First, we had the reporting that private equity firm Carlyle had pulled out of financing the deal, although A-Rod and Laurie then said they had partnered with Dial Capital to complete the next instalment they needed to take their further 40% stake in the Timberwolves and the Minnesota Lynx. And then what we got at the end of last week was a statement, again, that kind of dropped out of nowhere from Glenn Taylor, not only saying that A-Rod and Mark Lowry had missed the deadline to take control of the Timberwolves and the Lynx, but also that the two teams are no longer for sale. So that basically creates a very awkward situation now where you have Taylor still holding the majority stake and puts A-Rod and Lowry in this position where they've got the biggest minority share of 40% and are sort of left in the lurch a little bit by that.
Yeah, it's not the first time A-Rod's failed to buy a team either. He's been a bit unlucky in his pursuit of ownership in Major League sports. As you said, a bit of a mess. I don't really know what to make of it when something like this happens. Like, as you said, Glenn Taylor's there just sort of, I didn't really want this thing, but I've still got to keep it. And the other guys are sort of like, well, yeah, we'd like to take over, but we can't really have a say. Well, we can't have as much of a say as we'd like. All in all, one of those where you probably think in a couple of years' time that the situation will have to change.
Yeah, I should say as well, we've definitely not heard the end of it because A-Rod and Mark Lowry did put out a statement afterwards saying that basically accusing Glenn Taylor of seller's remorse, essentially said that they had met the deadlines and that they were currently undergoing NBA approval. So, yeah, we're going to have a lot of competing statements coming out over the next few weeks, I think. Maybe some legal posturing happening as well. But it is kind of interesting to hone in on that idea of seller's remorse because when Taylor did agree that deal, it was a $1.5 billion deal back in 2021. If you look at Forbes' most recent valuations, the Timberwolves are valued at $2.5 billion, and that's even without accounting for the Lynx, who their value will have gone up significantly since then as well. So perhaps Taylor is kind of trying to cling on a little bit because he's realised that the deal he agreed back in 2021 definitely isn't quite as favourable as it would be now.
I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. Sam, Arif, thank you very much for your time on this week's show.
Cheers, Dom.
Thanks for having me.